Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing into the shadowy corners of the ancient world, not to unearth glittering treasures or grand philosophies, but to listen to the hushed whispers of unease, the collective anxieties that clung to the very air people breathed. Imagine yourself walking down a dusty, unpaved road, the sun setting, casting long dancing shadows. Every creak of a cart, every rustle in the reeds, every oddly shaped cloud could be a sign, a portent, a tiny tremor in the delicate fabric of perceived order. It's a world where the ordinary could, with a sudden, chilling shift, become profoundly extraordinary, and often terrifying. Frankly, with the sheer number of things that could apparently curse you, from a sneeze at the wrong time to, yes, even which hand you favored, you probably wouldn't survive a week back then without inadvertently offending at least 3 minor deities and a grumpy ancestral spirit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. That fan you might have just turned on, its gentle whirring a comfort in the modern night, is a sound your ancient counterpart could only dream of. Instead, their nights, and indeed their days, were filled with a different kind of hum. The low, persistent thrum of potential threat, of meanings lurking just beneath the surface of the everyday. You feel it, don't you? This subtle tension in the ancient air. It's not just the physical dangers, the wild animals that might prowl beyond the flickering firelight, the sudden violent storms that could sweep away a season's crops, the ever-present threat of illness with no discernible cause or reliable cure. It's something more insidious, a psychological weight born from a world that felt far less predictable, far more actively populated by unseen forces and capricious wills than our own carefully curated, scientifically explained environments. You're constantly scanning, aren't you? Your senses are heightened, not just for the lion in the tall grass, but for the subtle signs, the whispers of the gods, the universe's coded messages, a bird flying from an unexpected direction, a sudden chill in the air on a warm day, the way the sacrificial animal behaves before the knife falls. These aren't mere coincidences. They are communications, often warnings. This intense vigilance means that the ordinary, the everyday, is never truly just ordinary. It's a stage upon which cosmic dramas play out, and you, a tiny human figure, are both spectator and often unwilling participant. Why this deep-seated anxiety about things that might seem to us mundane, even trivial? A significant part of it stems from the human brain's innate desire to find patterns, to impose order on chaos. We are, as a species, magnificent pattern-seeking creatures. This cognitive trait has been essential for our survival, allowing us to learn, predict, and navigate the world, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, which berries are safe, and which foretell a very bad afternoon. This very human tendency to find patterns and infer causal relationships, a phenomenon sometimes referred to by cognitive scientists as apophenia, when it leads to seeing meaningful connections in random or meaningless data, is a mainstream historical fact regarding our psychological development. But this powerful tool can also lead us astray, especially in situations of high uncertainty or fear. When something bad happens, a failed harvest, a sudden death, a plague, the mind desperately searches for a cause, an explanation, anything, to make sense of the senseless. And in a world without widespread scientific literacy, without germ theory or meteorology or astrophysics, those explanations often landed squarely in the realm of the supernatural, the superstitious. If your child falls ill after a black cat crossed your path, it's not a virus, it's the cat, or the dark forces the cat represents. If lightning strikes your neighbor's hut after he boasted of his wealth, it's divine retribution, not atmospheric electricity. The world, for many ancient societies, wasn't an impersonal system of natural laws. It was alive, imbued with intention, will, and often a rather touchy disposition. The gods were everywhere, ancestral spirits lingered, and nature spirits inhabited every rock, tree, and stream. Keeping all of them happy was a full-time job, and frankly, they seemed to take offense rather easily. So, the ordinary becomes a focal point for anxiety because it's the interface between your daily life and these powerful, unseen forces. Simple sneeze, for instance. Why would a sneeze, a perfectly normal bodily function, become imbued with such significance that in many cultures it required a blessing or a specific ritualistic response? Perhaps because it felt like something was being expelled or something could enter during that unguarded moment. It's a brief loss of control, a tiny crack in the body's defenses, and in an anxious world, any crack could let the bad things in. Consider also how easily difference, even slight deviation from the perceived norm, can become a hook upon which to hang these societal anxieties. If most people use their right hand for tasks, the person who predominantly uses their left stands out. They are different. And in a world struggling for coherence and predictability, difference can be unsettling. It's not a huge leap for different to become unnatural and then unlucky or even malevolent. The unfamiliar can be a blank canvas onto which a society projects its fears. These anxieties are then perpetuated, passed down through generations. Children learn from their parents, from the stories told around the fire, from the hushed warnings, and the public rituals. If everyone around you visibly flinches when a certain bird calls at night, or meticulously avoids stepping on cracks in the path, you absorb that fear, that caution, as a fundamental truth about how the world works. These beliefs become embedded in the cultural DNA, reinforced by shared experience and the powerful confirmation bias that makes you remember the one time something bad happened after an omen, while forgetting the 99 times it didn't. For instance, a quirky, lesser-known tidbit from some ancient cultures was the belief that if a usually placid domestic animal, like a dog or a cow, suddenly behaved erratically or made unusual noises for no apparent reason, it was a dire portent, perhaps signaling an impending death or disaster for the household. The ordinary animal, in its moment of unusual behavior, became a terrifying messenger. The precise origins and functions of such widespread societal anxieties are still a subject of rich discussion among anthropologists and historians. Some argue they primarily served as mechanisms for social control, reinforcing norms and group cohesion by defining us versus them, or proper versus improper, while others emphasize the cognitive aspects, seeing these fears as natural byproducts of how the human mind processes an often unpredictable world, especially in the absence of scientific explanations. Perhaps it's a bit of both, a complex interplay of mind, culture, and environment. You can feel that ancient air settling around you now, thick with unspoken rules and potential missteps. Every choice, every action, however small, carries a weight of significance. It's a tiring way to live, this constant low-level vigilance. And as you drift in this atmosphere of generalized unease, your thoughts begin to coalesce, to focus on one particular civilization that took this art of anxious observation to truly remarkable heights. A city of marble and might, of law and legions, but also a city profoundly, almost obsessively, attuned to the whispers of fate, the subtle shifts in the cosmic balance, and the ever-present possibility of divine displeasure lurking just around the corner. A place where the ordinary wasn't just occasionally extraordinary, but was constantly under scrutiny for hidden, often ominous meaning. The diffuse anxiety you felt in that generalized ancient air now begins to sharpen, to focus. You find yourself drifting, as if on a gentle current, towards a specific place, a city that will become the heart of a vast empire, a name that resonates through history, Rome. As you approach, you see its grandeur, the nascent splendor of its temples, the sturdy lines of its early walls, the bustling energy of its people. But beneath the surface of this pragmatic, organized, and increasingly powerful city, you sense something else, something akin to that earlier disquiet, but magnified, codified, and woven into the very fabric of its existence. You are stepping softly into the bustling, yet profoundly superstitious heart of ancient Rome, a city built not just on 7 hills, but on a bedrock of signs, portents, and an ever-present awareness of the shadows where the gods whispered and watched. The air here is alive with sound. The clatter of chariot wheels on uneven stone paving, the calls of street vendors hawking their wares, perhaps warm bread, ripe olives, or cheap wine, the murmur of Latin spoken in 100 different accents, the distant sound of a hammer on metal from a blacksmith's forge. You smell the dust of the unpaved side streets, the sharp tang of wood smoke from countless cooking fires, the incense wafting from a nearby temple, and underlying it all, the faint, ever-present scent of humanity living in close quarters. The buildings, some already impressive with their gleaming marble facades, cast deep shadows in the narrow alleyways. And it's in these shadows, around every corner, behind every imposing column, that the Roman imagination populated the world with omens. For the Romans, the world was not a neutral stage for human action. It was vibrant, alive, and constantly interacting with the divine sphere. The gods, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and a whole pantheon of major and minor deities, were not distant abstract beings. They were active participants in human affairs, their moods and intentions directly impacting daily life. And crucially, these gods could be easily offended. A misspoken word in a prayer, a ritual performed incorrectly, an act of hubris, or even just bad luck could incur divine displeasure, bringing with it misfortune, illness, or public disaster. This constant need to maintain the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, was a fundamental aspect of Roman life and religion. It was a transactional relationship. Humans offered worship, sacrifices, and adhered to prescribed rituals, and in return, the gods were expected to provide favor and protection. Break your side of the bargain, or even inadvertently step on a divine toe, and the consequences could be dire. This profound belief system meant that Romans lived in a state of perpetual alertness for signs from the divine. An omen, or omen, plural omina, could be almost anything out of the ordinary. A sudden clap of thunder from a clear sky, the sight of a snake crossing your path, an owl hooting in daylight, a dog carrying a lighted torch into a house, a particularly alarming one, that. Even a stumble on your own threshold as you left your home. All these could be interpreted as messages, usually warnings, from the gods. You would constantly be interpreting the world around you, looking for these divine signals. It must have been exhausting, like living in a perpetual escape room where the clues were often ambiguous and the stakes incredibly high. Did that black bird cawing on my left mean the gods approve of my business venture, or am I about to lose my tunic? Such thoughts might have been a daily occurrence. The Roman state itself took these matters with utmost seriousness. Before any significant public act, be it a declaration of war, the holding of an election, the founding of a new colony, or the construction of a major temple, the official priests, particularly the augurs, would be consulted. This is a mainstream historical fact. The augurs were highly respected officials whose job was to interpret the will of the gods by observing specific signs, most famously the flight of birds, auspicia. They would meticulously define a sacred space in the sky, the templum, and watch for the type of birds, the direction of their flight, their calls, and their behavior. A bird flying on the right might be favorable, while one on the left could be unfavorable, though the specifics were complex and depended on the context and the particular bird. Similarly, haruspices specialized in examining the entrails, especially the liver, of sacrificed animals for signs. A deformed or discolored liver could halt a major state enterprise. The meticulous attention paid to these divinatory practices underscores how deeply ingrained superstition was, even at the highest levels of Roman society and governance. Beyond these official channels, individual Romans engaged in a multitude of private divinatory practices and held countless superstitious beliefs. For instance, a quirky, lesser-known Roman practice involved ocelli. These were small masks or figures, often made of terracotta or wax, representing deities like Bacchus or other pastoral figures. They would be hung from the branches of trees, particularly in vineyards or gardens, and allowed to swing in the wind. The belief was that their movement helped to purify the air, ward off evil influences like the evil eye, malus oculus, and promote fertility and abundance in the crops. You can imagine these little faces gently turning and swaying in the breeze, silent, watchful guardians against unseen threats. It remains a subject of debate among historians and classicists how universally or deeply these beliefs were held by all Romans across the social spectrum. Did the pragmatic soldier on the frontier, facing tangible enemies, place as much store in the core of a crow as the anxious merchant in the city? Did the sophisticated, Greek-educated philosopher truly believe that the pattern of smoke rising from a sacrifice dictated future events? Or was adherence to these rituals sometimes more about maintaining social order and tradition? It's likely there was a wide range of belief, from fervent conviction to skeptical observance, much like in any society. However, the sheer pervasiveness of these practices in Roman literature, art, and public life suggests they formed a powerful undercurrent in the collective Roman psyche. This environment, so saturated with the need to discern favorable from unfavorable, correct from incorrect, and safe from dangerous, created a fertile ground for specific anxieties to take root and flourish. If the direction of a bird's flight could determine the fate of an army, if the twitch of an eyelid at the wrong moment could signal impending doom, then it's not surprising that other, seemingly minor aspects of human existence could also become laden with profound, often ominous significance. The way you gestured, the words you chose, even the very hand you used for everyday tasks, could all be drawn into this complex web of auspicious and inauspicious signs. It's in this city, a city of magnificent structures and deep, lurking shadows, that our particular exploration of the fear surrounding left-handedness will truly begin to unfold. You can feel it in the air, a subtle judgment, a preference for one side over the other, an unease with anything that deviated from the perceived right and proper way. The shadows in those Roman alleyways seem to deepen slightly, and the general hum of the city, with its undercurrent of divine watchfulness, now begins to focus on a very specific human attribute: the hand you favor. As you continue your gentle drift through this ancient metropolis, you become acutely aware of gestures, of how people interact with the world using their hands, and a subtle, yet pervasive, bias begins to emerge. You are about to unravel the core Roman apprehension surrounding left-handedness, a disquiet so ingrained that it's embedded in the very language they spoke, a fear that casts a long, sinister shadow over those who naturally favored their left side. The key to understanding this Roman anxiety lies quite literally in the Latin word for left, sinister. While today we primarily associate sinister with evil, malevolence, or ominous portents, its original neutral meaning in Latin was simply left or on the left side. The fact that this word for a mere direction evolved to carry such overwhelmingly negative connotations in many languages, including English, is a powerful testament to the deep-seated Roman unease with the left. Conversely, the Latin word for right, dexter, gave rise to words like dexterity and dexterous, implying skill, cleverness, and general positivity. The linguistic bias is stark and revealing. So, from the outset, the left hand was linguistically handicapped, associated with something inherently less good, less favorable than the right. But why? Why would such a fundamental distinction arise? Part of the answer lies in the deeply ingrained Roman religious and ritualistic practices you've already glimpsed. In many sacred contexts, the right hand was the hand of strength, good fortune, and correct action. When making offerings to the gods, when swearing an oath, when performing sacrifices, the right hand was almost invariably specified. It was the hand of engagement, the hand that connected with the divine in a positive way. Priests would use their right hand for sacred gestures. The dextrarum junctio, the joining of right hands, was a symbol of agreement, loyalty, and marriage. A powerful, positive image. If you were to inadvertently use your left hand in such a sacred context, it would likely be seen not just as a clumsy mistake, but as a potentially offensive, inauspicious act, capable of nullifying the ritual, or even angering the gods. Imagine the social pressure to conform, the constant vigilance required if your natural inclination was to use your left. This preference for the right was mirrored in the practice of augury. Remember those augurs meticulously observing the flight of birds. While the interpretation was complex, generally speaking, signs appearing on the right side, pars dextra, were often considered favorable, while those on the left, pars sinistra, were often inauspicious. This isn't universally straightforward, as some specific omens were favorable on the left, especially in Greek augury, which influenced Roman practices. But the general Roman tendency leaned towards the right as the side of good omen. So, the very sky above seemed to validate this right-sided preference. This directional symbolism permeated their worldview. The right was the side of light, order, and good fortune. The left was associated with darkness, chaos, and ill luck. This association wasn't just confined to high religious ceremony, it seeped into everyday superstitions and social etiquette. It was considered unlucky to enter a house with the left foot first. When giving or receiving objects, especially important ones, the right hand was preferred. Even in matters of personal hygiene, there were often distinctions. The right hand might be reserved for eating and clean tasks, while the left was relegated to less savory ones, a practical distinction that could easily morph into a symbolic hierarchy of cleanliness and purity. This distinction is a mainstream historical fact, observable in various cultures, not just Rome, where the left hand was often designated for unclean tasks, further associating it with negativity. Consider the word scavus, another Latin term, for left or left-handed, which also carried connotations of awkwardness, perversity, or ill omen. The Roman playwright Plautus, for instance, uses scava to describe an unlucky omen. Cicero, the great orator and statesman, speaks of omina scava, left-handed or unfavorable omens. There's a clear sense that to be left-handed, or for something, to occur on the left was to be out of step with the natural, favorable order of things. It was a deviation, and deviations in such a superstition-laden society were rarely seen as a good thing. It's important to note that this wasn't necessarily about persecuting left-handed individuals in a systematic, legalistic way, at least not in the sense we might think of persecution today. There weren't laws specifically outlawing left-handedness. However, the cultural bias was pervasive and would have undoubtedly created a subtle, constant pressure to conform. A child naturally inclined to use their left hand might have been strongly encouraged, perhaps even forced, to use their right for writing, eating, and other important tasks. This is a practice that continued in many cultures well into the 20th century. The awkwardness associated with left-handedness in a world designed by and for the right-handed majority would also have been a practical challenge. One quirky, lesser-known manifestation of this anxiety might be found in the interpretation of accidental actions. If a person, particularly someone in a position of authority like a magistrate or general, accidentally gestured with their left hand at a critical moment, or made a slip of the tongue that involved a left-sided concept, it could be seen as a deeply troubling omen, potentially requiring expiatory rites to avert divine anger. The left hand, in these instances, became a conduit for misfortune, an unwitting agent of bad luck. The precise extent to which everyday left-handedness was actively suppressed or simply viewed with suspicion is still a matter of some scholarly discussion, as direct testimony from left-handed Romans is, unsurprisingly, scarce. However, the weight of linguistic and cultural evidence points to a significant level of discomfort and negative association. You can almost feel that slight instinctive recoil if you were to say, Offer your left hand in greeting to a Roman citizen. Their eyes might flicker with momentary surprise, perhaps a flash of unease, before they politely corrected you or simply proceeded with a sense of vague disquiet. It's this unspoken, almost visceral reaction, this ingrained sense that the left is somehow off, that truly defines the Roman apprehension. It's not necessarily outright hostility, but a persistent low-level hum of negativity, a cultural assumption that the right way is, quite literally, the right way. And to be sinister, to favour the left, was to be perpetually, if subtly, at odds with the prevailing currents of fortune and divine favour. The word itself, echoing through the centuries, carries the weight of that ancient Roman fear. The weight of that word, sinister, hangs in the air, a constant, subtle reminder of the Roman unease. Now try to imagine navigating the bustling streets of Rome, the crowded forums, the intimate spaces of a Roman home, if your natural inclination was to favour that unlucky left hand. You are a lefty in Lazio, and daily life, even in its most mundane aspects, could be a minefield of potential awkwardness, unspoken judgment, and subtle, pervasive pressure to conform. The dilemmas you'd face might not always be dramatic or life-threatening, but they would be persistent, a series of small daily reminders that you were somehow out of sync with the expected order of things. Let's start with something as simple as a greeting. When meeting someone, particularly someone of higher status, the proper gesture would often involve the right hand, perhaps a handshake, the dextrarum junctio you recall, a wave, or a gesture of respect. If you unthinkingly extended your left hand, it could be perceived as a slight, a sign of disrespect, or at the very least, an awkward social gaffe. You'd quickly learn to consciously use your right, even if it felt less natural, less coordinated. This constant self-monitoring, this need to suppress your dominant hand in social interactions, would be a low-level stressor, a small but persistent cognitive load. It's like always having to remember to curtsy with the correct foot forward, but with the added layer of potential superstitious disapproval. Then there's the act of eating. In many Roman households, especially at formal meals, diners reclined on couches, typically on their left side, leaving their right hand free to take food from communal dishes. If you were left-handed, this posture itself would be awkward for eating. You'd either have to awkwardly reach across your body with your right hand, or risk using your left, which, as you've learned, might be associated with uncleanliness or ill omen, especially if others were watching. Cutlery as we know it was not in common use for most Romans. Hands were the primary tools. Imagine the subtle social dance around the shared platter of figs or olives, the careful maneuvering to use the correct hand, the slight hesitation if your instinct was to reach with your left. This seemingly small detail could make mealtimes a source of quiet anxiety. Writing, too, would present challenges. While literacy was not universal, for those who could read and write, the tools and techniques were geared towards right-handedness. Romans wrote on wax tablets with a stylus, or on papyrus with a reed pen and ink. The direction of Latin script, from left to right, is more naturally executed by right-handers, allowing them to see what they've just written and avoid smudging the ink. A left-hander would either have to adopt an awkward, hooked writing posture, risk smearing their work, or be painstakingly trained to write with their right hand. Many probably were. This forced conformity in such a fundamental skill would have been frustrating and could have led to perceptions of clumsiness or slowness in learning, even if the individual was perfectly capable. Consider participating in public life. If you were a citizen eligible to vote in the assemblies, or perhaps a magistrate making a public address, your gestures would be scrutinized. Orators like Cicero paid immense attention to their delivery, including their hand gestures, which were meant to emphasize and persuade. Using the left hand for prominent or assertive gestures might undermine the speaker's authority, or even be interpreted as a bad sign by a superstitious crowd. Think of the soldier in the Roman army. Military training heavily emphasizes uniformity and coordinated action. Drills, weapon handling, Swords were typically wielded in the right hand, shields in the left for standardized formations, and even marching would have been standardized for right-handers. A left-handed recruit would likely have been forced to adapt, potentially putting them at a disadvantage, at least initially. The precise challenges faced by left-handed soldiers in the Roman military is a topic where specific evidence is scarce, but the emphasis on uniformity in Roman legions, a well-documented mainstream historical fact, suggests strong pressure to conform. Even in leisure activities, your left-handedness might set you apart. Imagine playing a game of tali, knucklebones, or la trunculi, a board game similar to chess. If the game involved throwing dice or moving pieces in a way that favored right-handed dexterity, you might be perceived as less skilled or simply awkward. It's these small, everyday instances of friction, of not quite fitting the mold, that would accumulate, creating a sense of being subtly other. What about religious rituals performed at home? The paterfamilias, the head of the Roman household, would regularly make offerings to the household gods, the lares and penates, at the domestic shrine, or lararium. These rituals, though private, were still important for the well-being of the family. Using the wrong hand for these offerings could be seen as jeopardizing the family's fortune or health. A left-handed paterfamilias would either have to consciously perform these sacred duties with his right hand or risk causing anxiety among his own family members. One quirky, lesser-known dilemma might involve something as simple as pointing. In some ancient traditions, pointing with the left index finger was considered particularly unlucky, or even a form of curse. If your natural inclination was to point with your left hand, you'd have to be constantly vigilant to avoid causing offense or alarm. It's another tiny detail, but it adds to the tapestry of daily inconveniences and social pressures. Historians still argue about the degree of overt social stigma attached to left-handedness. Was it merely a source of minor awkwardness and superstition, or did it carry more significant social penalties? While direct accounts from left-handed individuals detailing their struggles are rare, the pervasive cultural bias, embedded in language, religion, and custom, suggests that life for a lefty in Lazio was, at the very least, less straightforward than for their right-handed counterparts. They would have existed in a world that was quite literally not designed for them, a world that subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, signaled that their natural inclination was somehow amiss, connected to the sinister, the unlucky, the less favored side of life. You can almost feel the weight of those small, daily adjustments, the constant low hum of needing to be just a little bit different from how you naturally were, simply to navigate your day without raising eyebrows or inviting misfortune. The subtle discomforts of daily life for a left-handed Roman now draw you towards the very heart of their spiritual world, to the temples and sacred groves where the will of the gods was sought and interpreted. Here, in the realm of Roman religious practices and divination, the concept of correct orientation, the significance of right versus left, reached its zenith. The direction of a bird's flight, the way smoke curled from an altar, or the choice of hand used in a sacred ritual held profound, often unsettling significance. To deviate from the prescribed norm was not merely a social blunder, it was to risk unraveling the delicate connection with the divine, potentially inviting celestial wrath. You find yourself standing before a Roman temple, perhaps on the Capitoline Hill, the air thick with the scent of incense and sacrificed animals. A procession of priests, robed in white, moves with solemn precision. Every gesture, every step, is freighted with meaning. As you learned, the augurs played a crucial role in discerning divine will. Imagine an augur, his gaze fixed on the sky, meticulously observing the auspicia. He has defined his templum, that sacred quadrant of the heavens, a flock of eagles soaring in from the right. Auspicious, a lone woodpecker tapping on a tree to his left. Potentially problematic, depending on the context and the specific question being asked of the gods. The Roman system of augury, though, influenced by Etruscan and Greek practices, developed its own complex set of rules. Generally, for the Romans, the right side was the pars familiaris, the familiar or favorable part, while the left was the pars hostilis, the hostile or enemy part when observing certain signs, particularly those related to the heavens. However, it's crucial to note, and this is often a point of confusion, that for some specific types of omens, particularly those observed on the ground or those interpreted from lightning, a specialized form of augury, the left could sometimes be considered favorable, as it was for the Greeks from whom the Romans borrowed certain divinatory traditions. This complexity meant that augury was a highly specialized skill, not for amateurs. This emphasis on direction extended beyond the sky. Haruspicy, the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals, also involved careful attention to orientation. The haruspex would scrutinize the liver, looking for any abnormalities in its shape, color, or texture. The different lobes and markings on the liver were mapped out, each corresponding to different deities or aspects of the future. A blemish on the left side of the liver, or an unnaturally small left lobe, could be interpreted as a dire warning. The health and orientation of these internal organs were believed to directly reflect the disposition of the gods. A healthy, well-formed liver, with all its parts in their correct place, signaled divine approval. Even the act of prayer was governed by orientation. Romans typically faced east when praying to celestial deities in the morning, and west in the evening. When entering a temple, it was customary to turn to the right. When performing libations, pouring wine or oil as an offering, the right hand was used. The sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta, tended by the Vestal Virgins, had to be maintained with meticulous care. Any accidental extinguishment was a terrifying omen, and the rituals for its relighting were precise and demanding, undoubtedly involving correct, right-handed procedures. This deep Roman concern with ritual purity and the exact performance of religious duties is a mainstream historical fact, reflecting their belief that the efficacy of a ritual depended on its flawless execution. Consider the suavitorilia, one of Rome's most important purification sacrifices, involving a pig, sus, a sheep, ovis, and a bull, taurus. These animals would be led in a solemn procession around the area to be purified, be it a city, an army, or a plot of land, always in a specific direction, typically to the right, clockwise, or deosil in some Celtic traditions, though the Roman emphasis was on the right. The priests conducting the sacrifice would use their right hands for the crucial actions. Any deviation, any mishap, an animal stumbling or trying to escape to the wrong side, could invalidate the entire costly and time-consuming ceremony, requiring it to be started anew, often with even greater anxiety. This focus on correct orientation wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about maintaining cosmic order, mat in an Egyptian sense, or ritus in Latin, the correct, divinely sanctioned way of doing things. The universe was perceived as having a proper alignment, and human actions, especially ritual actions, needed to harmonize with this alignment. The left side, being sinister, represented a potential disruption to this harmony, a step towards chaos or misfortune. A quirky, lesser-known aspect of Roman ritual orientation involved the mundus ceremony. The mundus cereris was a pit or underground structure in Rome, thought to be a gateway to the underworld. It was ritually opened 3 times a year, on days considered dies nefasti, days when public business was forbidden. During these times, it was believed that the spirits of the dead could roam the earth. The rituals surrounding the opening and closing of the mundus were undoubtedly performed with extreme care regarding orientation and gestures, lest these chthonic forces be improperly handled or unleashed. The direction one faced when dealing with spirits of the underworld would have been particularly critical, and likely involved specific uses of the right and left hands to channel or ward off influences. It remains a subject of scholarly debate. Exactly how these complex rules of orientation were developed and transmitted. Were they based on ancient astronomical observations, on perceived natural symmetries, or did they evolve more organically from ingrained cultural biases and psychological preferences for one side over the other? Whatever their origins, they became deeply embedded in the Roman religious consciousness, creating a world where every ritual act was a carefully choreographed performance, with the correct hand and the correct direction playing leading roles. For a left-handed priest, or even a layperson participating in a public ceremony, this would have demanded constant vigilance and a suppression of natural instinct, lest an inadvertent leftward gesture bring down not just personal misfortune, but divine anger upon the entire community. The stakes were incredibly high, and the pressure to conform to the right-handed rightward norm in sacred spaces would have been immense. The solemnity of the temple, with its precise rituals and directional anxieties, begins to fade, but the unease surrounding the left hand lingers, seeping into the more worldly aspects of Roman life. You now find yourself pondering a crucial question. Did this deep-seated cultural bias, this fear of the sinister, translate into tangible disadvantages for left-handed individuals in Roman society? Were they merely considered a bit awkward or unlucky? Or were they truly outcasts by dexterity, facing real limitations in their social standing, career paths, or even in the eyes of the law? While, as mentioned, there weren't explicit laws criminalizing left-handedness, the pervasive negative associations undoubtedly cast a shadow. Consider social standing. In a society that valued conformity and adherence to tradition, being noticeably different in such a fundamental way could lead to a degree of social marginalization. Left-handedness might have been seen as a minor physical anomaly, perhaps not as serious as a visible deformity, but still a deviation from the norm that could attract unwanted attention or subtle prejudice. Jokes or derogatory comments about left-handed clumsiness or ill luck might have been common, subtly reinforcing the idea that lefties were somehow off. For someone seeking to climb the social ladder or to marry into a prominent family, any perceived inauspicious trait, even one as seemingly minor as favoring the left hand, could have been a subtle impediment. It might not have barred them outright, but it could have been one more factor tipping the scales against them in a competitive social environment. When it comes to career paths, the implications become more pronounced. You've already considered the challenges a left-handed soldier might face. What about other professions? Think of a craftsman, a potter, a sculptor, a carpenter. Tools were, and often still are, designed with right-handed users in mind. A left-handed apprentice might have struggled to master their craft using tools that felt awkward or inefficient, potentially leading to perceptions of lesser skill or slower progress. This could limit their opportunities for advancement or their ability to earn a good living. In professions that required fine motor skills and public performance, like a scribe, a musician, or even a surgeon, though Roman surgery was a rather robust affair, the pressure to conform to right-handed techniques would have been immense. The Roman emphasis on skill and mastery, ARs, in crafts and professions is well documented, a mainstream historical fact, and any perceived lack of dexterity, even if due to ill-suited tools, could be detrimental. Could it have influenced legal perceptions? This is a more speculative area, as direct legal texts addressing left-handedness are absent. However, in a courtroom, where persuasion and perception are key, subtle biases can play a role. If an advocate consistently gestured with his left hand, or if a witness appeared awkward or shifty due to their left-handedness, perhaps subconsciously interpreted as nervousness or deceit by right-handed observers, it might subtly prejudice the judges or jury. Oaths, as you know, were sworn with the right hand. An inability or reluctance to do so, or doing so unnaturally, could potentially cast doubt on the oath-taker's sincerity in a highly superstitious environment. Again, these are subtle undercurrents, not explicit legal barriers, but they could contribute to a climate of disadvantage. It's also worth considering the realm of education. Children learning to write would have been strongly encouraged, if not forced, to use their right hand. This practice, common in many cultures until relatively recently, was likely prevalent in Rome. A child who struggled with this, or who was perceived as stubbornly left-handed, might have been labeled as a slow learner or difficult, potentially impacting their educational opportunities and consequently their future prospects. The psychological impact of being constantly corrected or made to feel that one's natural way of doing things was wrong could also have been significant, leading to feelings of inadequacy or frustration. One quirky, lesser-known area where handedness might have played a role is in art and depictions. If you look at Roman statues and reliefs, figures are overwhelmingly portrayed as right-handed, especially when performing actions of significance or authority. This isn't surprising, given the cultural bias. However, if a left-handed individual was depicted, it might have been for a specific symbolic reason, perhaps to denote something unusual, foreign, or even negative, depending on the context. The visual language of Roman art often reinforced societal norms and values, and the correctness of right-handedness would likely have been part of this visual messaging. The precise social and economic impact of being left-handed in Rome is still a subject that invites further research and interpretation by historians, as direct evidence is often circumstantial or inferential. There's no clear indication that left-handed people were systematically barred from all professions or reduced to a distinct underclass. However, it seems highly probable that they faced a series of subtle but persistent disadvantages, a kind of glass ceiling imposed by cultural superstition and practical inconvenience. They would have had to work harder to fit in, to overcome the inherent awkwardness of a right-handed world and to deflect the negative connotations associated with their sinister inclination. Imagine a Roman artisan, highly skilled but left-handed, constantly having to adapt his tools, or a young scholar whose natural writing hand is suppressed. Their talents might have been just as great as their right-handed peers, but they faced an additional, invisible hurdle. It's a reminder that societal biases, even those seemingly based on something as arbitrary as handedness, can have real-world consequences, shaping individual lives and opportunities in ways that are not always immediately obvious but are nonetheless impactful. They might not have been outcasts in the starkest sense of the word, but their path was likely a little more complicated, a little more shadowed by the weight of that ancient ingrained fear of the left. The subtle shadow of left-handed unease begins to broaden, and you realize that this Roman preoccupation with the correct way, the auspicious side, wasn't limited to which hand you favored. No, the Romans, in their constant quest to interpret divine will and sidestep misfortune, cultivated a vast and intricate catalogue of ill omens. It seems that for every potentially positive sign, there were a dozen ways things could go wrong, a dozen subtle and not so subtle warnings that the gods were displeased or that bad luck was lurking just around the corner. You're now expanding your sleepy exploration into this wider world of Roman anxieties, where ill omens seem to hide on every street corner, in every shadow, ready to pounce on the unwary. Remember that stumble on the threshold you considered earlier? That was a classic bad omen, the omen pedis offensio. To trip or stumble, especially when leaving your house or embarking on an important journey or task, was considered a highly inauspicious sign. It suggested that the endeavor was ill-fated from the start. A prudent Roman, upon experiencing such a stumble, might well turn back, postpone their plans, or at the very least, perform some kind of expiatory ritual to appease whatever divine forces had signaled their displeasure. It's a simple, everyday occurrence, yet laden with potential dread. Imagine the anxiety of trying to walk perfectly smoothly every time you crossed your doorstep for an important meeting. Then there were the sounds of the city, not just the mundane clatter and calls, but the specific animal cries that could send a shiver down a Roman spine. The unexpected hoot of an owl during the daytime was a particularly dreaded omen, often associated with impending death or disaster. Pliny the Elder, that great chronicler of Roman life and law, recounts instances where the appearance of an owl in the city prompted public purification rites. The caw of a crow or a raven could also be significant, its meaning often depending on its location, to the left or right, as you recall from augury, and the number of caws. A single, loud caw from the left might be a warning to halt your current course of action. It's as if the entire animal kingdom was in collusion with the gods, acting as their feathered or furry messengers. Snakes, too, held a potent symbolism. While sometimes associated with healing and protective spirits, like the genius loci, the spirit of a place, a snake suddenly appearing in an unexpected place, especially indoors, was often seen as a very bad sign, a chthonic warning from the underworld. Similarly, mice gnawing on objects, particularly sacred items or important documents, were considered an ill omen. Suetonius, the Roman historian, tells us that before the assassination of Julius Caesar, mice were reportedly seen gnawing on consecrated shields in a temple, a detail meant to highlight the impending doom. Even inanimate objects could become sources of anxiety. If a picture fell from a wall for no apparent reason, or if a beam in the house creaked ominously, it could be interpreted as a sign of trouble ahead. The spilling of salt or wine at a meal, while perhaps more of a social faux pas, could also carry a superstitious weight, a minor disruption in the expected order that hinted at larger misfortunes. The Romans were masters of finding meaning in the mundane, of seeing the hand of fate in the smallest of accidents. This intense focus on omens found in everyday occurrences is a mainstream historical fact about Roman popular religion and superstition, distinguishing it somewhat from the more formalized, state-sanctioned divination. The weather, of course, was a rich source of omens. Unusual meteorological phenomena, a sudden violent hailstorm out of season, lightning striking a sacred place, or the appearance of a comet, often called a hairy star, stella crinita, were almost invariably interpreted as signs of divine anger or heralds of significant, often calamitous, events like war, famine, or the death of a ruler. Public prayers and sacrifices would be offered to avert the threatened disasters. You can imagine the collective intake of breath, the hushed whispers spreading through the city when a comet blazed unexpectedly across the night sky. One particularly quirky, lesser-known category of ill omens involved speech. A slip of the tongue, lapsus linguae, at a critical moment, especially during a prayer or a formal address, could be disastrous. Uttering an unlucky word, or even a word that sounded like an unlucky word, could taint the entire proceeding. This led to a careful use of euphemisms. For example, because the Greek word for left, aristeros, also sounded like aristos, best, Romans sometimes preferred to use Greek terms in augury to avoid the negative connotations of sinister. There was also the omen verbale, an accidental utterance overheard by someone, which they then interpreted as pertaining to their own situation. If you were anxiously pondering a business venture and overheard someone nearby say, "It's a total loss," you might take that as a divine warning to abandon your plans. This belief in the power of chance utterances could make public spaces a minefield of potential unsolicited and often unwelcome advice from the universe. The precise origins of many of these specific omens are lost to time, likely evolving from a combination of observed coincidences, ancient folk beliefs, and the human tendency to seek patterns. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly interest how these beliefs were transmitted and maintained, and how they varied across different regions of the Roman world and different strata of society. Did a hardened legionary on the German frontier truly worry about a creaking beam in his barracks? Or were these anxieties more prevalent in the crowded, rumor-filled environment of the city of Rome itself? You feel a slight prickle of unease yourself, as if just by thinking about all these potential misfortunes you might attract one. The Roman world, for all its order and efficiency, seems to be a place where you had to walk on eggshells, constantly vigilant against inadvertently triggering divine displeasure or stumbling into a sign of impending doom. From the way a chicken ate its sacred grain, another form of divination called auspicium ex tripudiis, where a good appetite signaled favor, to the sudden appearance of a weasel, often a bad sign. The world was speaking, and you had to listen very, very carefully. It's a wonder anyone got anything done with all this constant, anxious interpretation of the surrounding environment. The general sense of unease from a world teeming with ill omens now begins to crystallize around something more specific, something more ordered, yet equally capable of inducing anxiety: numbers and dates. Just as the Romans saw significance in the flight of birds or the direction of a stumble, they also imbued certain numbers with specific properties, some lucky, many decidedly unlucky. And their calendar, far from being a neutral grid of passing time, was dotted with days deemed so inauspicious that all important business, public and private, would grind to a halt. You're now counting your way, very carefully, through these Roman numerological nightmares and the dreaded dates that cast a long shadow over their year. The Roman calendar itself was a complex affair, evolving significantly over time. The early, lunar calendar was notoriously difficult to keep aligned with the solar year, leading to confusion and the need for frequent intercalation, adding extra days or months. Even after Julius Caesar's reforms created a more stable solar calendar, the Julian calendar, which forms the basis of our own, the character of individual days remained a serious concern. Roman days were broadly classified. There were dies, fasti, on which legal and public business could be conducted, dies nefasti, when such business was forbidden, often due to religious prohibitions or because the day was considered generally unlucky, and dies comitialis, when public assemblies could be held. Navigating this schedule was crucial for any public, official, or anyone involved in legal or commercial transactions. Beyond these broad categories, certain days were marked as particularly black, or dies atri, singular dies eta. These were days associated with historical disasters, such as major military defeats. The Battle of the Allia, traditionally July 18th, where the Romans were catastrophically defeated by the Gauls in 390 BCE, was a prime example. This day, and others like it, were considered permanently unlucky. No sensible Roman would initiate any important undertaking on a dies ata. They would avoid starting journeys, making contracts, getting married, or engaging in any new enterprise. To do so was to fly in the face of fate, to practically invite disaster. These anniversaries of calamity served as potent reminders of Roman vulnerability and the anger of the gods. This observance of dies atri as days of national ill omen, where normal activities were curtailed, is a well-established mainstream historical fact of Roman public life. Then there were specific numbers that carried superstitious weight. The number 3 and its multiples were often considered powerful and positive, frequently appearing in religious rituals, e.g., 3 main offerings, prayers repeated 3 times. 7 was also generally seen as a significant and often auspicious number. However, other numbers were viewed with suspicion. Even numbers, for instance, were sometimes considered less lucky than odd numbers in certain contexts, perhaps reflecting a preference for asymmetry or dynamic imbalance over static symmetry. The precise reasoning behind these numerical associations is often obscure, likely rooted in ancient Pythagorean philosophies, Near Eastern traditions, or simply ingrained cultural preferences whose origins are lost. One particularly quirky, lesser-known, Roman numerical anxiety involved the number of guests at a dinner party. While the ideal number for a convivial gathering was often said to be no fewer than the Graces, 3, and no more than the Muses, 9, there were also specific numbers, to be avoided if one was superstitious. Having exactly 13 at a table, an anxiety that persists in some cultures even today, might not have been as prominent a fear for the Romans as it became later in Christian tradition, due to the Last Supper, but they certainly had their own numerological dining dilemmas. For instance, the number of items served or the arrangement of couches could be subject to superstitious scrutiny. The days of the month also had their own characters. The calends, first of the month, nons, 5th or 7th depending on the month, and ides, 13th or 15th, were important markers, and the days immediately following each of these, the post-riduani, were often considered unlucky, especially for starting new ventures. The Ides of March, of course, gained eternal notoriety as the date of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, forever cementing it as a day of ill omen in the Roman consciousness, though it wasn't necessarily considered particularly unlucky before that event. This highlights how historical events could retroactively imbue dates with powerful, superstitious significance. What about specific unlucky numbers in everyday life? While there isn't a Roman equivalent of, say, the modern Western fear of the number 13 being universally and intensely unlucky in all situations, the general principle of certain numbers being less favorable certainly existed. For example, when casting lots or dividing property, An outcome resulting in an unlucky number for an individual might cause them considerable anxiety. The specific unlucky numbers could vary based on local traditions or individual beliefs. But the underlying sense that numbers themselves possessed inherent qualities of good or ill fortune was widespread. It is a subject of ongoing discussion among classicists how deeply these numerological beliefs and calendar superstitions permeated all levels of Roman society and how consistently they were observed. Did the farmer in rural Campania meticulously avoid planting on a dies nefastus, or was this more of an urban elite preoccupation? While official state business would certainly adhere to the calendar's dictates, the extent of private observance likely varied. However, the sheer volume of references in Roman literature to auspicious and inauspicious days and numbers suggests it was a significant feature of their worldview. Imagine trying to plan your life around such a calendar. You want to start a new business? Better check if it's a dies fastus and not a dies ater, and definitely not the day after the calends. Planning a wedding, avoid those unlucky days like the plague. Even something as simple as deciding when to get your hair cut could, for the truly superstitious, involve consulting the calendar for a favorable day. It added another layer of complexity, another source of potential anxiety, to the already challenging task of navigating Roman life. You can almost feel the Roman citizen, perhaps a merchant or a politician, poring over a calendar, his brow furrowed, carefully plotting his activities to align with the favorable tides of time and number, and to sidestep those hidden numerical reefs and chronological whirlpools that threatened to wreck his endeavors. The calendar wasn't just a tool for marking time, it was a map of fortune and misfortune. The anxieties tied to unlucky numbers and ill-fated days on the Roman calendar begin to fade into the background, and you find yourself drifting into a more intimate, yet equally fraught space: the Roman bedroom. As night falls over the city and its inhabitants seek rest, a new realm of potential terror opens up. For in ancient Rome, dreams weren't just fleeting fancies, the random firings of a sleeping brain. Oh no, dreams were potent, often terrifying, messages from the gods, prophecies from the underworld, or even visitations from restless spirits. The interpretation of these nocturnal visions was a serious business, filled with anxiety and the urgent need to understand what the sleeping mind had witnessed, lest it herald some impending doom. You lie on a simple Roman bed, perhaps a wooden, frame strung with leather straps, covered with a straw-filled mattress and woolen blankets. The city outside is quieter now, but the internal world of dreams is just beginning to stir. As you drift off, you're not just surrendering to sleep. You're opening a door to another reality, a space where the veil between the human and divine worlds thinned considerably. The mainstream historical fact is that dream interpretation, or oniromancy, was a highly developed practice in the ancient world, with the Romans, like the Greeks and Mesopotamians before them, placing immense significance on the content and symbolism of dreams. Imagine waking in a cold sweat, your heart pounding, the vivid images of your dream still clinging to you like cobwebs. Perhaps you dreamt of flying, of falling, of teeth falling out, a classic anxiety dream even today, of talking animals, or of encounters with gods or long-dead ancestors. Your first instinct wouldn't be to dismiss it as just a dream. Instead, a wave of anxiety would wash over you. What did it mean? Was it a good omen, or more likely it often seemed a bad one? The need to decipher the message would be immediate and pressing. Professional dream interpreters, known as interpreters somniorum, were sought after by everyone from emperors to common folk. These individuals, often drawing on specialized knowledge, and collections of dream symbols, dream books like the famous one by Artemidorus from the 2nd century CE, though he wrote in Greek, his work was influential, would listen to your recounted dream and offer an interpretation, usually for a fee. Their interpretations were often based on complex systems of symbolism, where objects or events in a dream didn't necessarily have a literal meaning but stood for something else entirely. For example, dreaming of teeth falling out might not mean you were about to lose your teeth, but perhaps that you would lose a relative, or money, as teeth were sometimes seen as symbols of family members or wealth. The gods themselves were believed to communicate directly through dreams. Jupiter, Mercury, the messenger god, or even more shadowy deities from the underworld could appear in your sleep to offer guidance, warnings, or prophecies. A dream visit from a deceased relative was particularly potent. Were they offering comfort, or were they restless and in need of some ritual appeasement? The ambiguity of many dreams only added to the anxiety. Was that shadowy figure your beloved departed grandfather bringing a message of good fortune, or a malevolent spirit disguised as him, trying to lead you astray? Certain types of dreams were almost universally considered bad omens. Dreaming of fire, of floods, of snakes in the house, of your own death, or of public shame could all induce significant fear. If you had such a dream, you wouldn't just try to forget it. You would likely feel compelled to take action to avert the potential misfortune. This might involve specific prayers, sacrifices to the appropriate gods, especially chthonic deities, if the dreams seem to originate from the underworld, or purification rituals. Sometimes, people would try to tell their bad dream to the sun, or to a running stream, in the hope of dissipating its negative power. One quirky, lesser-known Roman practice related to bad dreams was to try and sell them. If you had a particularly ominous dream, you might recount it to someone else, symbolically transferring the ill fortune to them. It's a rather uncharitable form of dream therapy, but it reflects the desperate desire to rid oneself of the dream's negative energy. Another belief was that dreams occurring just before dawn were more likely to be true or significant. So, a disturbing dream in the early morning hours would cause even greater alarm than one experienced earlier in the night. The emperors and other powerful figures paid particularly close attention to their dreams and those of their close associates. A troubling dream experienced by Caesar or Augustus could have political ramifications, influencing decisions of state or prompting public religious ceremonies. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, frequently recounts significant dreams of the emperors and how they were interpreted, highlighting the importance placed on this form of divination at the highest levels. For instance, Caligula was said to have been so terrified by his dreams, often of being spoken to by the personified sea, that he would leap out of bed and wander the palace corridors at night. It remains a subject of discussion among historians how much these dream interpretations were genuinely believed versus how much they were manipulated for political or personal ends. A clever dream interpreter could certainly use their skill to flatter a patron or to subtly influence their decisions. However, the sheer pervasiveness of dream anxiety in Roman literature and personal accounts suggests a deep-seated, widespread belief in their prophetic power. So, as you lie there in the Roman night, sleep is not just a period of rest and recuperation. It's a journey into a potentially perilous landscape of divine messages and hidden meanings. Every sigh of the wind, every creak of the house, might seem to echo the mysterious pronouncements of your sleeping mind. The relief of waking could quickly turn to anxiety as you tried to recall the fleeting images, to piece together their significance, and to decide whether your nocturnal visions heralded good fortune or, as was so often feared, something far more sinister. The terror of dreams was a very real part of the Roman experience, turning even the sanctuary of the bedroom into a place of potential unease. The hazy, often unsettling landscape of Roman dreams begins to recede, and your focus shifts to another, universal human experience, one that for the Romans was particularly laden with anxiety and meticulous ritual, death and the afterlife. As you gently consider Roman superstitions surrounding funerary rites and the ever-present concern of pacifying restless spirits, you realize that for them, death was not simply an end, but a transition to a new state of being, a state that could have profound implications for the living if not managed with extreme care. The fear wasn't just of dying, but of what came after, and particularly of what the dead might do if they weren't properly honored and appeased. Imagine a Roman household where a death has just occurred. A palpable hush falls over the home. A sense of solemnity mixed with a distinct undercurrent of fear. The Romans believed that the spirit of the deceased, the manes, a collective term for ancestral spirits, though also used for an individual's shade, lingered near the body and the home until the proper funeral rites were completed. During this liminal period, the spirit was considered potentially dangerous, capable of causing misfortune if not treated with respect. The body would be washed, anointed, and dressed in its finest clothes, often with a coin placed in the mouth, or on the eyes to pay Charon, the ferryman who would carry the soul across the river Styx into the underworld. This practice of including a coin for Charon is a well-known mainstream historical fact about Roman and Greek funerary customs. The funeral procession itself was a public affair, especially for prominent families. It would wind its way from the home, through the streets, to the place of burial or cremation outside the city walls, as burial within the sacred boundary, the pomerium, was generally forbidden. Actors might be hired to impersonate the deceased and their ancestors, and professional mourners, prophetic, would wail and lament loudly. All of this was not just for show, it was part of the necessary ritual to honor the dead and ensure their peaceful transition. Any perceived slight, any cutting of corners in these elaborate proceedings could anger the spirit. After the burial or cremation, a period of mourning would follow, typically 9 days, culminating in a funerary feast, the Cena Novemdialis, held at the tomb. This feast was not just for the living. Food and wine would also be offered to the deceased, symbolically sharing a meal with them one last time. These offerings were crucial for nourishing the spirit and keeping it content in the afterlife. Neglected spirits were believed to become hungry, angry, and potentially malevolent, returning to trouble the living. These restless spirits were known as lemures or larvae, and they were greatly feared. The fear of lemures was so potent that a specific festival, the Lemuria, was held annually in May on the 9th, 11th, and 13th to appease them. During these nights, the paterfamilias would perform a curious, ancient ritual. Barefoot, he would rise at midnight, make a specific hand gesture, the mano fico, a fig sign, thought to ward off evil. To protect himself and wash his hands in pure spring water, he would then walk through the house, spitting out black beans or throwing them over his shoulder 9 times, without looking back, while repeating the incantation, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." The beans were thought to be offerings that the lemures would gather, or perhaps even embody the spirits themselves, which were then being expelled from the house. He would then clash bronze objects together to frighten away any remaining spirits, and finally, looking back, repeat 9 times, "Ghosts of my fathers, depart. Manes, exit paterni." Only then could the household rest, hopefully free from spectral harassment for another year. This detailed ritual, described by the poet Ovid, is a fascinating glimpse into the very real Roman fear of unhappy ancestors. The location and maintenance of tombs were also of great importance. Tombs were typically located along the roads leading out of the city, forming veritable cities of the dead. Families took great pride in their ancestral tombs and were expected to visit them regularly, especially on festival days like the Parentalia in February, to make offerings of food, wine, flowers, and light lamps. A neglected tomb was not just a sign of disrespect, it was an invitation for the spirits within to become troubled and potentially vengeolic. The inscriptions on tombs often included phrases like, "May the earth lie light upon you," "Sit tibi terra levis," expressing a wish for the peaceful rest of the deceased, a peace that was directly linked to the well-being of the living. One quirky, lesser-known Roman funerary superstition involved the fear of pollution from death. Anyone who had direct contact with a corpse or participated in a funeral was considered ritually impure, funestus, and had to undergo purification rites, typically involving water and sometimes the smoke of burning sulfur, before they could re-enter sacred spaces or participate in normal social life. This sense of death as a contaminating force underscored its dangerous, liminal nature. Even the house where a death occurred was considered tainted until purified. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate how these beliefs about the afterlife and the power of ancestral spirits varied across different social classes and over the long span of Roman history. Did the impoverished plebeian, buried in a common grave, receive the same level of anxious ritual attention as the wealthy patrician in their elaborate family mausoleum? While the scale and grandeur of the rites certainly differed, the underlying fear of restless spirits and the importance of appeasement seem to have been quite widespread. You can almost feel the chill in the air as the Roman paterfamilias performs his midnight bean-throwing ritual, the clanging of bronze echoing in the silent house. The desire to ensure the peaceful repose of the dead was driven not just by love and respect, but by a very real fear of what those spirits might do if angered or forgotten. Their world was populated not just by the living, but by a vast, unseen multitude of ancestors whose happiness and contentment were essential for the prosperity and safety of their descendants. Neglect them at your peril, for their displeasure could manifest as illness, misfortune, or terrifying nocturnal visitations. The boundary between the living and the dead was a porous one, requiring constant, careful management. The solemn shadows of Roman tombs and the anxieties surrounding their restless inhabitants begin to recede, and your perspective broadens. While Rome provides a particularly vivid example of deep-seated anxieties, especially concerning left-handedness, it's natural to wonder, was this fear a uniquely Roman obsession, or did other ancient civilizations share similar apprehensions? As you briefly glance beyond Roman borders, you find that the regard for the left hand, and indeed for omens and superstitions in general, was a complex tapestry, with threads of similarity interwoven with distinct cultural patterns. The left hand wasn't universally ill-favored with the same intensity, but a general preference for the right seems to have been a remarkably common human tendency. Let's drift across the Mediterranean, eastward, to the sun-drenched lands of ancient Greece, a civilization that profoundly influenced Rome in so many ways, including its religious and divinatory practices. Did the Greeks share the Roman terror of the sinister hand? The answer is nuanced. While the Greek word for left, aristeros, could also, somewhat confusingly, mean best or most excellent in certain contexts, perhaps a euphemism, or reflecting a different symbolic lineage, the general preference for the right hand in sacred and social contexts was still very much present. In Greek art, gods and heroes are almost invariably depicted as right-handed when performing significant actions. Offerings were made with the right hand, and oaths were typically sworn with it. Remember how Roman augury, while having its own distinct features, sometimes considered omens on the left as favorable. This was partly due to Greek influence, where in some forms of divination, especially those involving bird flight observed from a particular orientation, the left could indeed be the side of good fortune. This difference highlights that while a right-hand preference was common, the specific symbolic interpretations could vary. However, the Greeks certainly had their share of superstitions and anxieties about ill omens. They too were meticulous observers of bird flight, sneezes. A sneeze to the right was generally good, to the left, bad. And chance utterances, cladonomancy. They believed in the evil eye, Bascania, and used various apotropaic symbols, like the Gorgoneion, the head of Medusa, to ward it off. So, while their specific anxieties about left-handedness might not have reached the linguistic and cultural intensity seen in Rome with the word sinister, they lived in a similar world saturated with potential portents and the need for ritual propriety. Now let's journey further south to the ancient civilization of Egypt, with its monumental pyramids and intricate hieroglyphs. What was the status of the left hand along the Nile? Egyptian art, much like Greek and Roman, overwhelmingly depicts figures, especially pharaohs and deities, as right-handed in dominant actions. The right was often associated with action, power, and giving, while the left could be associated with passivity and receiving. In some contexts, the left hand was specifically designated for unclean tasks, a practical distinction that, as in Rome, could contribute to negative symbolic associations. However, The Egyptian worldview was profoundly dualistic, often seeing complementary roles for right and left, rather than a purely oppositional one. For instance, in some depictions, the god Thoth, the scribe of the gods, is shown writing with his left hand, which might suggest that for specific divine functions, or in certain contexts, left-handedness was not necessarily viewed negatively. This is a mainstream historical fact about Egyptian iconography that offers a contrast to the more consistently negative Roman view. The precise social implications for an ordinary left-handed Egyptian are less clear from the historical record than for a Roman, but the artistic conventions suggest a strong right-hand preference in idealized portrayals. What about other ancient cultures? In ancient Mesopotamia, home to the Babylonians and Assyrians, divination was an incredibly sophisticated and central part of life. They practiced exdispicy, examining entrails, especially the liver, much like the Romans, astrology and dream interpretation with meticulous detail. While specific textual evidence focusing on anxieties about left-handed individuals is not as prominent as in Rome, the general emphasis on ritual correctness and the interpretation of every conceivable phenomenon as a potential omen suggests that any deviation from the norm, including pronounced left-handedness, would likely have been noted and perhaps viewed with some suspicion or as a sign requiring interpretation. Across the globe, in ancient China, the concept of yin and yang emphasized balance between complementary opposites. The left was often associated with yin, feminine, passive, dark, receptive, and the right with yang, masculine, active, light, creative. This wasn't necessarily a good versus evil dichotomy in the Roman sense, but rather a necessary balance. However, in certain ritual contexts or social etiquette, there could still be preferences for the right hand as the hand of honor or action. It's a subject of ongoing scholarly research how these philosophical concepts translated into everyday social attitudes towards left-handed individuals in different periods of Chinese history. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit regarding handedness comes from some interpretations of ancient Celtic and Germanic cultures. While evidence is often fragmentary and filtered through later Roman or Christian writers, there are suggestions that in some warrior contexts, left-handed fighters might have been seen as unpredictable and therefore dangerous opponents, perhaps even possessing a certain uncanny or magical quality. This offers a different perspective, where left-handedness, instead of being purely negative, could sometimes carry an aura of formidable peculiarity. So, was the Roman fear of the left hand entirely unique? Not in its entirety. A general preference for the right hand seems to be a widespread cross-cultural phenomenon, possibly rooted in the slight statistical majority of right-handers in the human population, leading to tools, customs, and environments that naturally favor them. What perhaps set the Romans apart was the intensity of the negative linguistic association with sinister and the degree to which this bias was woven into their state-sanctioned religious practices and everyday superstitions. While other cultures might have seen the left as simply less skilled or associated it with passivity or a different kind of sacredness, the Roman association often carried a stronger whiff of genuine misfortune and ill omen. The fear wasn't just that the left hand was awkward, but that it was actively unlucky, a potential conduit for negative forces. As you look beyond Rome's borders, you see a spectrum of attitudes, but the long shadow of the sinister hand, in its most potent form, seems to fall most heavily on the cobbled streets of the Eternal City. The specific anxieties about left-handedness, whether Roman or from neighboring cultures, begin to soften and blend into a wider, more eclectic collection of ancient human worries. As you continue your sleepy survey, you find that the human capacity for developing peculiar beliefs, quirky quibbles, and inexplicable fears extended far beyond which hand one favored. From strange food taboos that dictated what could and couldn't pass your lips, to inexplicable phobias about certain animals or objects, the ancient world was a veritable smorgasbord of curious customs designed to navigate a world perceived as fraught with hidden dangers and arbitrary rules. Let's start with food. Beyond simple matters of taste or availability, Many ancient cultures developed elaborate food taboos, often rooted in religious beliefs or superstitious associations. The Pythagoreans in ancient Greece, for example, famously abstained from eating beans. The exact reasons for this are debated by scholars. Some suggest it was due to a belief that beans contained the souls of the dead. Others point to phobias, a genetic condition causing adverse reactions to fava beans, prevalent in the Mediterranean. While some interpretations suggest a more symbolic meaning related to flatulence being disruptive to contemplative thought, or beans being used in voting procedures. Whatever the reason, for a Pythagorean, a simple bean was not just a food item, but a forbidden object laden with spiritual significance. Similarly, ancient Egyptians had various food taboos, some specific to certain priestly classes or particular times of the year. Certain types of fish, for instance, might be forbidden, perhaps because they were associated with a malevolent deity or a mythological event. Breaking such a taboo wasn't just a dietary indiscretion, it was a spiritual transgression. Then there were the inexplicable animal phobias, or at least strong aversions that went beyond practical concerns. You've already encountered the Roman fear of owls hooting in daylight, but other creatures could also inspire dread for reasons that seem obscure to us now. In some cultures, an encounter with a weasel or a shrew might be considered a terrible omen. Why these small, relatively harmless creatures? Perhaps their sudden darting movements, or their association with the earth and unseen spaces, lent them an uncanny quality. The specific animals feared varied from culture to culture, but the underlying tendency to project anxiety onto certain members of the animal kingdom was widespread. This is a mainstream historical fact. Animal omens, both positive and negative, played a significant role in the divinatory systems and popular beliefs of most ancient societies. Objects, too, could become focal points for peculiar anxieties. Consider the Roman fear of iron in certain sacred contexts. While iron was essential for tools and weapons, it was often excluded from particular religious rituals or sacred spaces. For instance, the Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter, in Rome, was forbidden to have any knots in his clothing, to touch or even name a dog, a goat, ivy, beans, or raw meat. And notably, he was not allowed to have iron tools used to cut his hair or nails. These had to be done with bronze. The precise reasons for these taboos are complex and debated, but they reflect a belief that certain materials or objects were inherently incompatible with sacred purity or possessed disruptive qualities. Iron, being a metal associated with warfare and industry, might have been seen as too profane for certain holy rites. Color symbolism also played a role in these quirky quibbles. While you've heard about the Roman preference for red flannel in a medicinal context, other colors could carry negative connotations. In some ancient societies, wearing a certain color on a particular day or for a specific event might be considered unlucky or inappropriate, inviting misfortune. These color associations were often deeply ingrained and learned from a young age, contributing to a shared cultural understanding of what was safe and what was risky. What about sounds? Beyond specific animal cries, other noises could trigger anxiety. The unexpected creaking of a house, as you heard, was a common Roman fear, but even the sound of certain words or names could be problematic. If someone's name sounded too similar to an unlucky word, they might adopt a nickname to avoid constantly invoking that negative association. This belief in the inherent power of words and sounds, known as onomancy or onomastic divination in some contexts, reflects a world where language itself was seen as an active force, capable of shaping reality. One quirky, lesser-known category of ancient anxieties involved reflections and shadows. In some cultures, seeing one's reflection in water under certain circumstances, or having one's shadow fall in a particular way, or be stepped on, could be considered a bad omen, perhaps suggesting a vulnerability of the soul. The soul was often thought to be linked to one's shadow or reflection, and any harm or unusual occurrence involving these could be interpreted as a threat to one's well-being. It adds a whole new layer of self-consciousness to simply walking. down the street on a sunny day. It remains a subject of ongoing scholarly fascination, how these incredibly specific and sometimes bizarre beliefs arose and persisted. Some may have originated from genuine, though misinterpreted, observations. Perhaps someone once fell ill after eating a particular food under specific circumstances, leading to a taboo. Others might have been remnants of older, forgotten rituals whose original meanings were lost, leaving only the perplexing custom behind. And many were likely products of the human imagination's fertile capacity for creating patterns and associating unrelated events, especially in times of stress or uncertainty. As you drift through this cabinet of ancient curiosities and cultural quibbles, you see a world far richer and far stranger than a simple focus on left-handedness alone would suggest. The human mind, in its quest for meaning and control, seems to have an almost limitless capacity for imbuing the mundane with extraordinary significance, for drawing lines between the safe and the perilous in the most unexpected places. From the beans on your plate to the colour of your tunic, from the weasel in the hedgerow to the creak of your floorboards. The ancient world was alive with a symphony of unspoken rules and potential missteps, a constant, quiet hum of what-ifs, and, just in cases, the kaleidoscope of peculiar ancient beliefs, the food taboos, the animal phobias, the strange customs, begins to settle, and your mind, lulled by this parade of historical anxieties, turns to a gentler, more philosophical contemplation. Why? Why did so many societies, particularly those of antiquity, develop such deep-seated, pervasive fears, especially those targeting seemingly arbitrary distinctions like left-handedness, or natural everyday occurrences like a sneeze or a dream? As you softly philosophize on the psychological underpinnings of these widespread societal fears, you begin to see not just random quirks, but reflections of fundamental aspects of the human condition. At its core, much of this anxiety stems from a basic human need for control, or at least the illusion of control, in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Ancient life, as you've glimpsed, was fraught with uncertainties. Famine, disease, natural disasters, and sudden violence were constant possibilities. Lacking the scientific explanations and technological buffers we often take for granted, people sought other ways to make sense of their experiences and to feel they had some agency in influencing outcomes. Superstitions and omens, in a way, provided a framework for understanding and navigating this uncertainty. If you could identify the signs of impending misfortune, perhaps you could take steps to avert it, perform a ritual, offer a sacrifice, avoid a certain action. This provided a psychological balm, a sense that you weren't entirely at the mercy of capricious fate. The fear of the different, or the other, also plays a significant role. Humans are social creatures, and group cohesion has always been vital for survival. Anything that deviates from the established norms of the group can be perceived as a potential threat, whether it's a person with different customs, different beliefs, or even different physical characteristics like left-handedness. Labeling the different as unlucky, unnatural, or even malevolent can be a way of reinforcing group identity and maintaining social order. It creates an us versus them dynamic, where we are correct and safe, and they are a source of potential disruption or danger. This isn't necessarily a conscious, malicious process, but rather a deep-seated psychological tendency to categorize and to favor the familiar. The very existence of a norm implies an abnormal, and anxiety often attaches itself to the latter. Cognitive biases, those predictable patterns in human thinking that can lead to errors in judgment, are also powerful contributors. Confirmation bias, for example, would have strongly reinforced superstitious beliefs. If a Roman believed that stumbling on the threshold was a bad omen, they would vividly remember the one time they stumbled and then had a bad day, while conveniently forgetting the many times they stumbled and nothing untoward happened. This selective memory strengthens the belief in the omen's validity. Similarly, the availability heuristic, where we overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, often because they are dramatic or emotionally charged, would make memorable instances of bad luck following an omen seem more common than they actually were. These cognitive shortcuts, while often useful, can entrench irrational fears. The power of social learning and cultural transmission is another crucial factor. As you considered earlier, these beliefs and anxieties were passed down from generation to generation. Children learn what to fear and what to revere by observing the adults around them and by listening to the stories and myths of their culture. If your parents visibly react with alarm to a specific sign, or meticulously perform a certain ritual to ward off bad luck, you internalize that behavior and the underlying belief. This creates a powerful cycle of reinforcement, making these fears deeply embedded and resistant to change, even in the face of contradictory evidence. This process of cultural inheritance of superstitious beliefs is a mainstream historical fact, observable across diverse societies and time periods. Furthermore, there's the inherent ambiguity of many omens and prophecies. A dream, a bird's flight, the entrails of an animal. These are rarely straightforwardly clear. Their interpretation often required specialized knowledge, or at least claimed specialized knowledge, which gave power and status to priests, augurs, and dream interpreters. The ambiguity also allowed for flexibility. If a predicted outcome didn't occur, it could be explained away by a misinterpretation, an insufficient ritual, or the intervention of another, more powerful deity. This lack of falsifiability is a hallmark of many superstitious systems, allowing them to persist despite a lack of consistent empirical support. One quirky, lesser-known psychological aspect to consider is the human tendency towards anthropomorphism, attributing human-like intentions and emotions to inanimate objects or natural phenomena. If a storm rages, it's not just a weather system, it's an angry god. If a statue falls, it's not gravity, it's a sign of displeasure. This personification of the world makes it feel more relatable, perhaps, but also more prone to taking personal offense. It transforms the environment from a neutral backdrop into a cast of characters who must be constantly appeased and understood. It is a subject of ongoing debate in psychology and anthropology to what extent these fears are innate, hardwired into our brains as evolutionary adaptations, e.g., a primal fear of snakes or spiders might have survival value, versus how much they are purely culturally constructed. The answer likely lies in a complex interplay between our evolved cognitive architecture and the specific cultural contexts in which we are raised. Our brains may be predisposed to certain types of anxieties, but culture shapes the specific forms those anxieties take. Ultimately, these ancient fears, from the Roman dread of the sinister hand to the elaborate precautions surrounding dreams and death, reveal a profound human yearning for meaning, order, and security in a world that often provided little of each. They are a testament to our imaginative capacity, our ability to weave complex narratives to explain the unexplainable, and our deep-seated need to feel that we are not simply adrift in a sea of chaos. While the specific objects of fear may seem strange or irrational to us now, the underlying psychological mechanisms, the search for patterns, the fear of the unknown, the comfort of ritual, and the power of belief, are timeless and deeply human. The philosophical mists surrounding the origins of these ancient anxieties begin to thin, and you find yourself observing a slow, almost imperceptible shift across the centuries. Just as these fears of the left hand, of ill-omened birds, of unlucky numbers, took root and flourished in the fertile ground of human psychology and cultural transmission, so too did they eventually begin to wither, their potent grip on the collective imagination gradually, almost reluctantly, loosening. This fading of phantoms wasn't a sudden exorcism, but a slow, uneven process, influenced by a myriad of subtle changes in how people perceive the world and their place within it. You notice, as time unspools, that the once vivid terror inspired by a specific omen might, over generations, soften into a milder superstition, then perhaps into a quaint folk belief, and finally, for many, into little more than a historical curiosity. What caused this gradual disenchantment? One of the most significant, though very slow-acting, agents of change was the gradual rise of rationalism and scientific understanding. As you've touched upon, the work of early scientists and philosophers who championed observation, reason, and empirical evidence over blind adherence to tradition began to chip away at the foundations of a world ruled by omens and divine caprice. The discovery of natural laws governing phenomena like weather, disease, or astronomy provided alternative explanations that didn't rely on the whims of easily offended gods. If lightning was an electrical discharge rather than Jupiter's thunderbolt, then perhaps its striking a particular temple was a matter of physics, not divine wrath. This didn't happen overnight, of course. The transition from a magical worldview to a scientific one was a long and often contested journey. The rise of major monotheistic religions also played a complex role. While these new faiths often brought their own sets of rules, rituals, and supernatural beliefs, they sometimes actively sought to supplant or discredit older, polytheistic systems and their associated pagan superstitions. For example, early Christian authorities often condemned Roman practices like augury or household worship of lares and penates as demonic or idolatrous. While this didn't eradicate superstition entirely, indeed new superstitions often arose within the new religious frameworks, it did contribute to the decline of some specific ancient anxieties. The focus shifted from placating a multitude of local nature spirits and interpreting bird flights to adhering to the doctrines and commandments of a single, supreme deity. Social and political changes also had an impact. The consolidation of large empires, while sometimes incorporating and standardizing certain superstitions, as Rome did, could also lead to a broader exchange of ideas and a gradual dilution of purely local beliefs. Increased literacy and access to different philosophical schools of thought, though limited to a small segment of the population for much of history, provided alternative ways of understanding the world that didn't rely solely on traditional folklore. As societies became more complex and interconnected, some of the more insular village-level superstitions might have found it harder to maintain their hold. The mainstream historical fact of increasing urbanization over many centuries, for instance, while creating new anxieties, also sometimes distanced people from the direct, daily interactions with the natural world that had spawned many nature-based omens. It's important to understand that this fading was rarely a complete erasure. Many ancient beliefs didn't simply vanish, they transformed, adapted, or went underground. A Roman fear of a particular unlucky day might morph into a medieval peasant's avoidance of that same day for planting, but with the original reasoning, long forgotten, replaced by a more general sense of, it's just not done, or a specific ritual to appease a local Roman deity might be subtly incorporated into the veneration of a local Christian saint. Superstitions are remarkably resilient and can be very adept at cloaking themselves in new cultural attire. Consider the fear of left-handedness. While the intense Roman association with the sinister gradually softened as Roman paganism declined, a general bias against the left hand persisted in many cultures for centuries, often reinforced by practical considerations. In a right-handed world, and sometimes by new, albeit different, negative connotations. However, the specific terror, the sense that using the left hand could directly invite divine wrath or nullify a sacred ritual in the Roman polytheistic sense, slowly faded with the gods it was tied to. The waning of these specific anxieties was also incredibly uneven. Some beliefs, particularly those related to fundamental human experiences like death, dreams, or luck, proved far more tenacious than others. While a sophisticated Roman intellectual during the late Empire might have privately scoffed at the idea of a crow dictating military strategy, they might still have felt a twinge of unease about a particularly vivid nightmare or ensured their family funerary rites were properly conducted just in case. It's a testament to the power of these deep-seated fears that they often outlived the specific cosmological frameworks that birthed them. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this fading process is how some omens became defanged or reinterpreted. For instance, a sign that was once considered a dire portent might, in a later, less anxious era, be seen as merely unusual or even a quaint curiosity. The sense of immediate, personal threat recedes. Scholars still debate the exact timelines and mechanisms for the decline of specific superstitions, as it varied greatly by region, social class, and the particular belief in question. It wasn't a linear progression from superstitious to rational, but a messy, complex evolution of human thought and cultural practice. You can sense this slow thaw, this gradual lightening of the ancient air. The shadows don't seem quite as menacing, the whispers of the gods not quite as loud or demanding. The world is slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a slightly less enchanted and perhaps a slightly less terrifying place. The phantom of the ill-omened owl hooting in daylight might still evoke a momentary startle in a Roman villager centuries after Augustus, but it might not send the entire community into a panic requiring public purification. The grip is loosening, the ancient fears slowly, like receding tide marks, beginning to lose their dominion over the human mind. The long shadows of ancient fears, the Roman dread of the sinister hand, the anxious interpretation of dreams, the meticulous appeasement of ancestral spirits, have now stretched and thinned, becoming almost translucent in the gentle light of passing centuries. You find yourself drifting back towards the present, leaving behind the world of augurs and ill-omened owls. Yet, as you settle into the quiet of your own time, a thought might just flicker. Have these ancient anxieties truly vanished without a trace? Or do their faint, almost imperceptible echoes still whisper in the quiet corners of our modern minds, especially as we drift off to sleep? Consider the simple act of saying "bless you" or "Gesundheit" when someone sneezes. It's a common courtesy, an almost automatic response in many cultures. But its origins, as you've glimpsed, are ancient, rooted in a time when a sneeze was seen as a vulnerable moment, a potential expulsion of the soul, or an invitation for spirits to enter. While most of us no longer consciously believe these things, the custom persists. A tiny fossilized remnant of a once potent fear, now softened into a social nicety. It's an echo, isn't it? A gentle reverberation from a distant, more anxious past. What about knocking on wood to ward off bad luck after boasting, or avoiding walking under a ladder? These are common superstitions that many people observe, sometimes half-jokingly, sometimes with a genuine, if unacknowledged, twinge of apprehension. The origins of these practices are varied and often obscure. Knocking on wood might have been linked to ancient beliefs about tree spirits, while avoiding ladders could relate to their triangular shape resembling a gallows or disrupting a symbolic trinity. Regardless of their precise lineage, they represent that same ancient impulse to perform a small ritual, to acknowledge the possibility of unseen forces, to take a tiny step to keep misfortune at bay. The Roman citizen meticulously avoiding a stumble on their threshold would likely understand the impulse perfectly. Think about the lingering unease some people feel about the number 13, especially Friday the 13th. While its specific association with bad luck is more rooted in Christian tradition, the Last Supper, and possibly Norse mythology, Loki being the 13th uninvited guest at a banquet in Valhalla, the underlying concept of certain numbers or dates being inherently unlucky is a direct descendant of ancient numerological anxieties like those you encountered in Rome. The Roman who dreaded the dies atri would find a kindred spirit in someone who nervously checks their calendar for Friday the 13th. This persistence of unlucky numbers is a mainstream historical fact of folklore studies, demonstrating the long afterlife of such beliefs. And what of dreams? While modern psychology offers various explanations for their origins and content, from processing daily experiences to random neural firings, many people still experience a sense of unease or significance after a particularly vivid or disturbing dream. We might not rush off to a professional interpretes somniorum as the Romans did, but a nightmare can still cast a shadow over our morning, making us wonder, just for a moment, if it means something. That little niggle of doubt, that fleeting search for meaning in the nocturnal theatre of our minds, is an echo of the profound Roman terror of dreams. Even the way we sometimes talk about luck, beginner's luck, a stroke of bad luck, don't tempt fate, carries faint reverberations of a world where fortune was seen as a capricious, external force, rather than simply the outcome of probability or circumstance. These phrases are like linguistic fossils, preserving ancient attitudes within our modern vocabulary. The Roman, carefully observing omens to gauge the disposition of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, would understand our turn of phrase, even if our underlying cosmology has shifted. One quirky, lesser-known echo might be found in certain modern sporting rituals. Athletes who wear the same lucky socks for every game, or who perform a specific sequence of actions before competing, are, in a way, engaging in a form of personal omen-seeking and ritual appeasement, very similar to what an ancient Roman might have done before an important undertaking. They are trying to control the uncontrollable, to find a pattern that leads to success, to ward off the bad luck of a poor performance. It is a subject of ongoing psychological and sociological research, why these seemingly irrational beliefs and practices persist in an age of science and technology. Perhaps they offer a sense of comfort in an uncertain world, a feeling of agency, however illusory. Perhaps they are simply ingrained habits, learned in childhood and carried into adulthood, without much conscious thought, or perhaps there's a part of the human psyche that remains attuned to the possibility of something more, a lingering openness to the idea that not everything can be explained by logic and reason alone. As you lie here, on the cusp of sleep, the world outside your window is, for the most part, disenchanted. The gods no longer hurl thunderbolts from clear skies, and the flight of a pigeon is unlikely to halt a government meeting. Yet, as you close your eyes, if a black cat darts across your mental path, or if an old superstition about not sleeping with your feet facing the door flickers through your mind, you are experiencing a faint, distant echo of those ancient Romans, a people who lived in a world alive with signs, shadows, and the ever-present whispers of the unseen. These lingering superstitions are the gentle ghosts of anxieties past, a soft reminder of our shared human history, a history filled with the fascinating, sometimes fearful, and always deeply human attempt to make sense of it all. The stories of ancient Rome, with their marble columns and shadowy portents, the anxious scrutiny of a left hand, the careful interpretation of a bird's flight, or the hushed recital of a charm to appease a restless spirit, now begin to soften and recede. The weight of those old pervasive fears, the constant vigilance against ill omens and divine displeasure, gently lifts, like a morning mist dissolving in the warmth of the sun. These tales of human anxiety, of trying to find order and safety in a world that often felt capricious and filled with unseen forces, have served their purpose for tonight. Allow your mind to drift away from the bustling forums and the silent tombs. Let go of the image of the augur, his gaze fixed upon the sky, or the Roman citizen carefully stepping over a threshold. Instead, feel the simple, undeniable comfort of your own surroundings, the quiet of your own space. The world outside, with its own modern complexities, can fade into the background. Here, in the stillness of this moment, there is only the gentle invitation to rest, to let go. The journey through these ancient anxieties, these deeply human attempts to navigate an uncertain world, serves as a soft reminder of the path we have traveled. The concerns that once loomed so large, that dictated so much of daily life, have, for the most part, become the stuff of history, whispers from a time when the veil between the mundane and the magical was far more permeable. And as you rest, you can do so with a sense of quiet gratitude for the understandings that have eased so many of those ancient burdens. Imagine the deep, collective sigh of relief that might have swept through those past societies if they could have known a fraction of what we now understand about the world. Let that sense of peace, of burdens lightened, settle over you. Your breathing deepens, your muscles soften further, and any lingering thoughts of sinister hands or ill-fated days become distant, like stars seen from the bottom of a deep, calm well. The only task before you now is to embrace the quiet, to allow the natural rhythms of your body to guide you into a peaceful, untroubled sleep. Let the echoes of the past fade into a gentle, soothing hum, a lullaby composed of histories, quiet turning pages. Rest now, drift easily, sweet dreams, end of script, sweet dreams.